The first bullet cracked the night like a verdict, and Marcus Mace Calder felt it carve straight through the hollow they'd built around him, right through the warehouse rafters, past the string of bare bulbs, into the rhythm he used to count breaths and debts. He moved before his mind did, hand dipping to the pistol at his hip because that was the reflex that had kept him alive, because a Reaper's body answered the first sign of blood or betrayal without asking questions. The man in the shadows at the far door went down as the second shot sang. The man in the shadows was younger than he'd expected, throat opened like a confession. Someone behind him swore. Silas cursed low. The warehouse smelled of oil, sweat, and something sour, fear, or maybe the end of an arrangement. Wait before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. Rosa Alvarez walked into that sliced-open world like she had every right to be there. Small, hair braided down her back, leather jacket cinched against the night. But every pair of eyes in the room went to the rumble behind her before they landed on her. 40 chrome skulls and roaring engines, a wall of Hell's Angels colors rolling like weather. They had expected a nobody, a soft-spoken woman with nothing to bargain, and a meek apology to grease a new ceasefire. They had practiced the humiliation, the speech Mace had rehearsed in the warehouse light, the cadence of power he used to keep his men in line, the quiet that made rivals remember their place. They had not expected thunder. Mace straightened slowly, the pistol returning to its holster by his hip because he needed the conversation to be theirs to own. The Iron Reapers ringed him. Broad shoulders, tattoos like maps of claim and sacrifice, eyes that had learned to read men as easily as they read a road. Silas stood beside him, a muscle of a man with a face mapped by old hurts. He tightened his jaw, the old enforcer's calculation flickering across him. This could go two ways. It could end with heads bowed, rope thrown over some concession, the Reaper's pride sealed back up. Or it could end with an ignition none of them wanted. Rosa moved between the bikes and the men like she was stepping into a yard shed always owned, and Mace felt a strange thing tighten at the base of his throat. Not fear at first, not exactly, but the dread of being watched naked. He had been president of the Iron Reapers long enough to know the smell of leverage. He also knew the shape of a setup. The Angels' colors were a promise he could not refuse, and Rosa carried a weight in her eyes that did not match the smallness of her hands. There was a ledger in her stare. He could see it when she looked at him, gratitude braided with accusation. "Well," he said, voice steady because that was his oldest armor, "so the rumors were wrong. You didn't come alone." "They weren't rumors," Rosa replied, and when she smiled it was brief and shut away. Her voice was low, careful as if testing the air. "I brought what we agreed." Silas took a step forward, the old lawman in him wanting to inspect the proof. And what would that be? A witness? A hit? Rosa's fingers tightened on the strap of her bag. For a dangerous second, no one spoke. The motorcycle engines growled behind her like distant thunder ready to roll in. A kid from the Reapers, one of the prospects, made a misstep, and Mace looked at him like a man who could make or break a life with a pronunciation. Everything in that look said, "You breathe wrong, and you won't be the one to tell the story." "Protection," Rosa said, "and a truth." There is a particular kind of silence that follows a word like that in a room full of men who live by omissions. A truth was a blade they didn't yet know how to sheath. Mace's mouth hardened. He'd spent decades building his house out of secrets and silence. His club's mythology depended on the right lies. The Iron Reapers were carved by long roads and harder losses. Every scar was a ledger of territory and oath. If Rosa carried a truth that could fracture those ledgers, a proof that implicated a man Mace had sworn to protect, then everything would shift like gears stripped by grit. "Names," Silas said, slow. "We want names." Rosa took the small bag off her shoulder and set it on the crate beside her. The Angels leaders were on their bikes, watching through their visors, but there was no mistaking the power in their posture. They were an army that would glue any open wound shut with violence if asked. Rosa, though, reached into the bag with fingers that trembled once. When she brought the thing out, it was not a gun, not drugs, but a battered recorder, the kind you could tuck into a pocket and forget until it saved you. It glinted like a promise. "Play it," Mace said, before he could stop himself. The order came as habit. He needed to control his breathing. The recorded voice that came out sounded like water through stone, raw and damaged and impossible to smooth. It carried a name that Mace knew like a scar. He sat down on the overturned crate with a sound that might have been a laugh if it hadn't been edged with something else, a recognition he had not expected. The tape was older than the faces in the room, but younger than the wound it reopened. It told of a night at a border bar, of men who drank too much and cheered too loud, of knives and a gun fired out of habit and fear. There was the voice of a boy confessing things that argued with loyalty. There was a voice Rosa had recorded herself, stating facts with a calm that made a lie impossible. The name on the tape, Moss's sworn man, the brother he had promoted, the one whose oath he had taken into his own hands, tied into a massacre that had cost families and tilted the town toward ruin. Silas' face changed. Mace felt each micro-adjustment as if the air itself had tightened. The Reaper's code was a simple ledger. Protect your own, silence your debt, bury the ones whose truths could infect. Yet the Angels demanded seat. They had come for protection, for the safety of innocents in Rosa's town, and for a transfer of leverage nobody in the Reaper's ring wanted to acknowledge. Rosa had hidden for years, playing the nobody, gathering favors and keeping a secret that could topple men and empires. Tonight, she unwrapped it in front of them like a dare. "You're using us," Mace said, because the thought cut deeper than any accusation he could make. It was both an admission and an act of tenderness. His tenderness for the club that had kept his heart steady all these years. He tried to find the angle that would protect them and still afford him the tools of war he might need when the truth spilled outward. Rosa's answer came not as anger, but as a small, sharp exhale. "I'm protecting kids, Mace, women, people who wake up to nothing because they live under a banner that doesn't care for them anymore. I'm not asking you to open your chest. I'm asking you to stop lining it with lies. There is a cadence to bargaining in a world of leather and chrome. Power is never simply taken. It is traded, bartered, measured." Mace listened to each syllable as if it were a dare. He had known Rosa's family name in the dark spaces of his memory. Prospect riders who had been chewed up in a turf war that metastasized until it consumed them. He had not known she had survived by becoming a shadow that knew every ledger the Reapers kept. It was a betrayal with surveillance. She had the list, the roll call of killings the Reapers thought they'd buried. "You think you can walk in with 40 angels and change the law?" One of the Reapers sneered, because that was the easiest reaction in a room where pride sat like a rock in everyone's guts. The sneer landed like a match. The Angels leader dismounted with a slow, careful grace, flames in his eyes that meant he understood the economy of threats. 39 engines kept a respectful distance. Rosa didn't flinch. "Our people are tired of being collateral," she said quietly, and the way she spoke sent a track of tenderness through the center of the room like an undertow. "We want a truce that means something. We want safety. I brought the proof that things were covered up so they wouldn't have to look at what they'd done." Silas leaned forward. "So you come as a witness and not," his voice dropped, "a green? Someone who cooperates?" The implication was knives. To cooperate with outsiders was to shatter the code. To be a rat was to be dead. There was a hush, and in the pause, Mace heard the rustle of gloves and the snap of leather as men shifted their stance, the way dogs show teeth when a stranger raises a hand too quickly. He felt, absurdly, like a father whose child had revealed an injury the family had kept secret. The club's mythology was at risk. The ledger was showing entries that could burn. Rosa looked at him like a woman who had measured the sea and the shore and decided which would drown first. "I have to keep them safe," she said. "I cannot watch them be pushed into a corner that ends with a funeral every time another piece of turf is claimed. If keeping them safe means I stand with people who will stand tall, who will hold us when the reapers can't or won't, then I will do it." Mace wanted to ask for the names on the tape to be silenced, to be burned as he had burned paper before, to smooth over the wound and keep his men whole. There was a part of him that will always put the club before everything, because that's what it meant to lead. But leading also meant reckoning. A president marked by losses learns that sovereignty sometimes looks like protection, not domination. He could feel the room tilting. Some of his men would choose the ledger, others the pulse. "Talk," he said finally. "Tell me exactly what you want, and we'll decide. But you understand who you threaten when you come here with angels behind you." Rosa's mouth set hard. "I want a safe corridor to my town. I want the reapers to stop taxing what little people have left. I want the woman who runs the diner, who keeps all the kids fed, to be left in peace." She swallowed. And her voice softened as if the next admission hurt because it was thin. "I want you to stop covering for the man on that tape. If he did what he's accused of, he shouldn't be walking free under our colors." Silas' jaw worked. Mace felt the muscle above his eye tick. That old animal calculation. Code against conscience. The warehouse's lights hummed. Outside, one of the angels kicked a cigarette into the gravel and stamped it like a punctuation. The room had become a courtroom by degrees, filled with men whose loyalties were hung like coats on a peg. "I can't promise what I don't know," Mace said, low. "I can't punish a brother on a rumor. But I can look. I can investigate. You hand me the tape, we take it, we figure it out. Quietly. No massacre of reputations. No public spectacle." Rosa almost laughed, but it came out as a sound that was half prayer. "You can look," she said, "but you won't bury it." Mace nodded once, not because he trusted her, not because he wanted to, but because the angel-backed woman across from him had given him a bargain he couldn't refuse, and a mirror he didn't want to face. He felt something move inside him, an old muscle that had been taught to clamp down on vulnerability loosen. Maybe that was the real threat Rosa brought. Not the angels, not the leverage, but the insistence that he answer a truth. He had built his life on roads and rules. Now a woman with small hands and a big silence had offered him a different road, one where protection meant more than power. He didn't know yet whether he could travel it, but he heard the engines, and he heard the recording, and he felt the way the night had been split open. "All right," he said. "We look. We don't make a theater of it. You keep your angels in place while we do. If we find it true..." He left the rest unsaid, because in their world, endings were always violent dreams. "If we don't," he added, because it had to be balanced, "I'll make sure you and your town get what you came for." Rosa nodded as if she had expected anything less than the arithmetic of risks. The angels tugged at the hems of their jackets like kings readying for war. Silas studied Rosa like a man reading the underside of a coin. Mace felt his knees settle. Outside, the engines idled like beasts biting for release. The warehouse had become, with the turn of a single tape and the arrival of a nobody who was not a nobody, the center of a fragile calculation. A deal had been struck on paper that smelled faintly of gun oil and faith. It would be enough to start, but not to finish. Between the roar of the bikes and the low hum of the lights, between the ledger of the past and the tape that could bleed it open, they had arrived at a dangerous line. Do they keep the club's mythology intact and risk the quiet suffering of a town? Or do they let truth cleave the myth and find out who they'd become on the other side? Mace had years of muscle memory for choosing the first. Rosa had spent years surviving on the second. Neither of them that night knew which one of them would break. The warehouse smelled like promises and gunmetal when Mace closed the crate and handed the recorder to Silas. He watched the way his enforcer's fingers hovered over the device, as if touching it would make the voices inside bleed out and into the room, and felt the weight of 100 small reckonings settle across his shoulders. The angels kept their distance, black leather a horizon of intent. Rosa stood where she'd been placed by fate and by her own stubbornness, a figure of someone who had been refusing to be written small for a long time. For a breath, the men in the room were only men again, not presidents, not prospects, not patch holders, just men who had to decide whether to be brave enough to face what had been done in their name. Silas clicked the recorder off and leaned close enough that Mace could see the tiny scar at his temple, the mark of some long-forgotten scrap. "Well, hear it again," he said, voice low, professional. "I'll make copies. We'll get statements. Quiet, like you asked." Even as he spoke, though, his eyes kept moving to Rosa, measuring her hands, the line of her jaw, the steady way she breathed. There was curiosity under his suspicion, old hurt learning to be curious rather than immediately defensive. It was a dangerous thought for men like them, curiosity that led to mercy. "Good," Rosa said, and for the first time the tremor in her hands slid away. She wrapped her fingers around a thermos she had pulled from her bag, as if the act of holding something domestic could stitch a seam in the tension. "There's more. I have names, dates, places, a ledger, like you said. Not everything is on tape. Not everything can be on tape, but enough." Mace let the name ledger fall heavy in the warehouse. He'd heard that word for decades. He had it tattooed in his movements, in the way he looked at a man and decided whether to keep him or bury him. The ledger was the truth the club prided itself on burying. Now it lay, thin and vulnerable, in the hands of a woman whose life had been picked apart by the very pages it held. "We'll need to verify," Silas said. "We don't hand a man's future to a story." "We don't hand a man's future to another man's blood either," Rosa replied. The edges of her voice had teeth. "My family bled because nobody wanted to look. She stopped, the name sticking like a shard, was cornered because it was easier to say he ran." A murmur moved through the reapers like wind through dry grass. Men shifted. Promises that had been solid as stone began to show cracks. Mace felt it in his own bones, the slow erosion that came when a story you had leaned on for years turned out to be made of clay. He thought of his own losses, of the bodies he couldn't rescue, and the faces of men he'd sent to keep a balance. The presidency had been a ledger too, lines drawn and redrawn to keep chaos at bay. He'd been the one to lay down the rules. Now someone else had handed him a ledger he hadn't asked to read. "Give us a night," he said. "We look, we interview. If it's true, we deal with it the club way." "And if the club way is silence?" Rosa asked, voice like cracked glass. "Are you willing to trade their funerals for your quiet?" He could have answered with the old defenses, the rhetoric that had carried him through worse storms. Instead, he surprised them all, including himself, with the smallest admission. "I don't know, but I will not promise you the club's silence without knowing what it will cost." His words were a concession grounded in hardness. He would look, but he would not hand over his club to a verdict from the street. He would not let the reapers be railroaded, and neither would he let the town be chewed to dust waiting for his decision. Rosa's face softened in a way that Mace's gut clenched. "That's all I ask. Look." They left the warehouse with arrangements awkward as truce lines. The angels formed a protective arc around Rosa's shadow as they moved to their bikes. She climbed with practiced ease into a saddle that had been hers for years. The way she swung a leg over the seat showed a familiarity that belonged to someone who had been on the road far too long. Mace watched the contour of her back tighten as if she was braced for impact. He wanted to tell her it would be different now, that investigation didn't always mean reprisal, but silence came easier to men and harder to women like them. Over the next 24 hours, the Reapers moved like a beast dividing itself to heal. Silas and 3 trusted lieutenants, men with older scars and hands that could still remember kindness, took the recorder and began the slow, meticulous work of verification. They spoke to bartenders who remembered the night, to mechanics who'd seen the blood, to priests who'd hidden bodies beneath sanctuaries. They listened for inconsistencies, for corroborations, for a human pattern that could be trusted. Each name Rosa had given unfurled questions and possibilities. Some were small cruelties, some were monstrous arrangements of power and cowardice. The ledger wasn't neat. It was messy and human, full of compromises that had seemed sensible at the time and monstrous in the dark. Mace spent his hours differently. He walked the border of his territory, ran his fingers along the metal of his bike like a man counting his sins. He called in favors with an economy of words, asked for discreet checks, for eyewitness accounts. He kept one ear open for noises in the club, rumors, whispers, names being repeated like litany, and another for how Rosa's town might be breathing. Did the diner owners sleep? Did the mothers walk with their kids to school unafraid? The ledger, the tape, the sight of that small woman flanked by an army tugged at him in ways he didn't want to admit. He had always thought of power as something you held at arm's length to preserve it. Rosa's presence made him see power as hands to be used, to cradle. At dusk, Silas returned with 2 men who'd been on the night in question. They were not likely saints, men who had lived hard and done harder things. Their faces were maps of regret and practicality. They sat across from Mace in the back room of the clubhouse, where the light was kinder and flatter. One of them, a mechanic named Ortiz, rubbed his knuckles nervously and began to speak. "It ain't pretty, Mace," he said, "but it happened like she said. The kid," his voice broke, "we were drunk, yes, but someone pulled a trigger on purpose. It was more than reckless. And some of us, we covered. We took less. We lied for brothers. I lied." He looked down like a man admitting to sins to a man who had authority. "Sorry." Silas' jaw hardened, but there was a softness at the edge of his words. "You did what you thought was right then," he said. "Now you tell what was right." You could feel the gravity of the room shift slightly as truth made its entrance. Mace sat like a pillar trying to keep a house from falling apart. Each confession was a small hammer blow to the wooden beams of their mythology. He could teach men to ride, to fight, to survive. He couldn't easily teach them how to live with the aftermath of decisions that hurt innocence. He recognized, too late perhaps, that healing demanded reckoning, and reckoning demanded humility. He thought of Rosa then, of the way she had carried the ledger like a soft and dangerous thing. She had chosen to show it in public, to risk herself under the vulture's eyes. And that choice lodged in Mace like a splinter. There was bravery in what she had done, a kind of brave that had nothing to do with iron and everything to do with bones. He imagined her back at the angels' encampment, speaking to the leaders, watching, waiting for the verdict from men who might never understand the cost of truth. Word moved through the reapers like a disease or a cure, depending on where you sat at the table. Some of Mace's men were furious, older men who had been raised to believe that the club's cohesion was worth more than any mother's grief. They saw Rosa as an intrusion, a girl who had the audacity to ask for things that would unmake their world. Others moved toward the possibility like men who had been living under an old law and suddenly glimpsed an alternative, that protection could mean preventing harm rather than cementing dominance. That night, Mace found himself in the parking lot with Silas, the hum of engines a low chorus. They both stared at the horizon where the angels had gone, their silhouettes swallowed by the night. "We look like cowards if we don't act," Silas said. There was a tiredness to his voice that Mace hadn't heard before. "We look like liars if we cover," Mace answered, "and we will lose everything if we do neither." A long silence folded between them. Mace thought of how he had always measured success by borders drawn and kept. He thought of the families in Rosa's town who counted their dead and asked no one important to answer, and the pressure of that ledger sat heavy. "Warn the others," he said at last. "No whispers, no vendettas. If this blows, it blows through the club, not out to the street." His voice was thin with concessions made because he had no other map to follow. Silas nodded. "And Rosa?" "She's protected," Mace said. "For now, but not from what she knows. From those who might use what she knows." Saying it aloud felt like placing a hand on a wound. It did not heal it, it only marked it. The next day, the investigation deepened. Names were cross-checked, testimonies compared. The ledger grew thicker with each corroboration, folding in small betrayals and grander, deliberate crimes. Men were called in, one by one, and asked to speak the truth into air that would carry it beyond them. Some of them did, some of them did not. Mace watched the faces of those who owned their parts, men who had been broken but who wanted, desperately, to be better than their worst night. He watched the faces of those who turned away, who clung to silence like a shield. He cataloged them like a man deciding who would be forgiven and who would be asked to leave. Meanwhile, Rosa ran the town she loved. She slept poorly, the weight of her decision pulling at her ribs. The angels were present, not as an occupation, but as a deterrent, their colors visible at the outskirts like a promise carved in muscle. Mothers stopped by her with tears and offerings of tamales and coffee. Children left drawings at the mechanic's door. The gratitude was palpable and terrifying. She had not asked to be a savior, only to be a witness. Yet the town treated her as both. It made her small and enormous at once. When night came and the tape's testimony reached a point where the ledger could no longer be ignored, Mace sat again with his counsel. He felt like a man standing at a dam, aware that letting one truth through could flood everything downstream. He thought of the faces of his boys, of his club's longevity balanced against a mother's sorrow. He thought of Rosa, standing under a sky she had crossed with angels behind her. He thought of the children whose laughter he had heard once at a crossroads festival and who now might never laugh again if the myths that protected his world remained unchallenged. "We choose," he said, the declaration a blade making a path. "We deal inside. We don't let this rot on the street, but we also don't bury it. If men are guilty, they answer. If not, we protect the innocent who were damaged by lies." His words were careful and true, and, in their own way, revolutionary for a man who had been raised to equate strength with denial. It was a small revolution. It would not fix everything. It would not mend every scar. But it set a motion, an acknowledgement that protection did not mean perpetuating harm. Rosa heard of it at dawn, the message arriving by a messenger who smelled of grease and coffee. She breathed in as if for the first time and closed her eyes. The town breathed with her. That night, Mace rode past the Angels' camp on his way to empty roads, and in the corner of the world where their lights burned low, he saw Rosa sitting by a fire, jacket on her knees, the recorder beside her, quiet like a sleeping animal. She looked up when he slowed and didn't flinch when he dismounted and stepped close. Around them, the Angels nodded but did not intrude. They had done their work, but they had not steered it. The road hummed below them, carrying miles and memories. "You're not a nobody," Mace said before he could stop himself. The admission came raw and unplanned, a shard of something he had not let himself feel in years. It wasn't flattery, it was recognition. Rosa stared into the fire for a long time. Nobody was easier, she said, but nobody couldn't keep them safe. Her voice was small and fierce. I couldn't watch them die for the sake of a club's honor. He sat beside her and watched the flames lick at the darkness, saw in them both the danger and the warmth of truth. "We'll see this through," he said, "properly. No theater. Justice, or at least as close as men like us can come to it." Rosa's smile was brief, a flash of something relieved and grief-worn. "That's all I wanted." They sat in silence that was not empty. It was a trenchant, shared space where the past and the future rubbed against each other. Engines hummed softly in the distance, a lullaby for those who had lived too long on the edge. In that moment, the push and the pull, the negotiation of power and protection, the striptease of vulnerabilities each had kept hidden, felt like a new road unfolding. It would be long and dangerous and full of detours. But for the first time since she had walked into the warehouse, Rosa felt like she had a partner at her side who could translate threats into shelter. They would both learn in the coming days what it truly cost to choose truth over myth. They would both have to let go of comfortable lies and face the unadorned ledger at the heart of their world. And when the first of those reckonings came, they would be there, close enough to hurt, close enough to mend. The tension throbbed like a wound waiting to be tended, but under it was a pulse, something honest and dangerous, a draft of air that could be the beginning of breathing new. Silence is a dangerous thing in a room full of men who live off sound. It breeds ideas, conspiracies, half-breaths that become weapons. The next morning, the clubhouse smelled like old coffee and fresher trouble. Men moved around the tables like ghosts in a room they'd once owned outright. Hands on mugs, teeth on judgments, eyes on the ledger that Rosa had laid down like a live coal. The tape's weight had not lessened, it had simply changed the form of each man's thinking. The fractures didn't crack in a day. They crept, hairline fractures running through hardened belief, and rounding the corner of the main room, Mace could see them. A prospect sitting too straight, an old-timer slumping like a man who'd been made to carry more than his share. Silas was merciless in his work because he had to be. Mercy, in their world, was an act that could kill the merciful in the dark. He had taken the recorder, replayed the footage until the voices were familiar, until the hesitation and the coughs became landmarks on a map of that night. He had gone further, tracking down bartenders and men who'd been paid to keep quiet, mapping the ways a code can calcify into corruption. He came back with names, with half-truths and whole denials, and with a look that taught Mace something about rage that had been tempered by grief. Rage, Silas seemed to say with his clenched jaw, could be a tool if you didn't let it eat you whole. But not everyone wanted to be cut by truth. There are men who built their lives batting down the lid of inconvenient memories. When the ledger's pages began to be read aloud, starting with Ortiz's shaking admission, some of Mace's lieutenants shifted in the room as if standing in front of a firing squad. Loyalty had been currency in the Reaper's bank. To exchange it for moral reckoning felt like bankruptcy. One of them, Ramirez, old enough to be considered a guiding hand and young enough to fear displacement, spat on the table. "You gonna throw your brothers to the wolves over a reclaimed story?" he demanded. His voice trembled with more than bravado. It carried the weight of a man whose identity was wrapped in a patch on his chest. "Not throw," Mace said, and he felt the room lurch like a ship altering course. Account, responsibility. If we're honest with ourselves, we either protect our people or we protect our lies. We can't do both. The word account had an effect like a stone dropped in a still pond. Ripples moved out, men whispering, younger ones glancing at their fathers, women at the edges of the room drawing closer. Rosa's ledger had begun to ask a question no one had wanted to answer. What is the club for if not to protect those who cannot protect themselves? The more they dug, the more uncomfortable the answer became. Because the ledger did not reveal angels and demons, but men who had made small, selfish choices that had escalated into communal tragedy. It was a betrayal the Reapers would have preferred to be simple. A single villain, a single sin, a tidy confession, and a ritual to wash it away. Instead, the ledger read like a town's history. A patchwork of complicity that had been smoothed over with money, apologies, and bragging rights. The tape named a man Mace had called brother. The ledger named others, men who had been careful to keep their hands clean by throwing another's into the fire. That was the kind of fracture that does not break a bone. It eats at the muscle that holds the joint together. Rosa watched the shifts like a cartographer reading a coastline. In her town, life had continued under a different set of bargains. Kids learning to fear the wrong hoodie, women teaching each other how to find safety in doorways. She had carried names not because she enjoyed the power, but because power had been the only tool left that could stop the rot. Her town's gratitude was a complicated thing. It came with demands. They wanted safety and swift justice, and a future that didn't smell of funerals. Rosa wanted that for them too, but she also wanted it without sending more men into graves. She had seen how revenge becomes another kind of cage. The first fracture widened where it always did, with family. A brother of one of the men named on the ledger burst into the clubhouse half drunk and half honor. A jagged thing of accusation and hurt. "You gonna hang my blood out to dry?" he shouted, eyes wild. "You gonna let her," his gesture took in Rosa's name without speaking it, "make law?" The room closed around him like an instruction manual for anger. Some men bristled, ready to protect kin. Others looked away, counting if their loyalty had a price. That evening, Mace rode to Rosa's town himself because he needed to understand what the ledger had cost them in human terms. The road there was long enough that memories crop up like road signs, places where things had happened and where he had gone on because leaders were supposed to compartmentalize. He thought about the first time he'd put a patch on, the smell of grease and new leather. He thought of his father telling him what a man of a club owed to the town he claimed. The ledger made those lessons complicated. Protect your own. Honor your brothers. But what if those brothers had made a bargain with cruelty? Rosa met him at the diner with a pot of coffee and the quiet that was her armor. Mothers in the back pretended not to stare. Kids were at the counter, drawing a mural of bikes and a sun they hoped would never set on their town. When the truth came close enough to touch them, their faces showed it, wonder and fear braided tight. "You did this," she said simply, not accusing, just stating. "I didn't plant the seeds," Mace replied, "but I'm the one who kept the garden. I have to know what grows out of it now." His admission was raw. He sat opposite her and watched the way she folded her hands around a mug as if it steadied her bones. "We found corroborations, more than we wanted. Some men will need to answer." Rosa's eyes flashed, pain, then anger, then something that looked dangerously like relief. "Then let them answer," she said, "but don't make theaters of it. Don't let them be dragged into the street to be killed for being weak. Some of them were coerced. Some of them were scared, but some of them knew. Hold them to it. Make them fix it." "Fix it how?" Mace asked. Fixing in their world often meant burial or excommunication. a brutal arithmetic that left more bodies than solutions. But he had started a process. Once truth was in motion, it demanded attention like a living thing. "Make them pay attention to what it costs when they don't," Rosa said. "Not just with blood, with labor, with service. Let them be useful in undoing what they did. Let the men who profited feed the town they hurt, rebuild what was burned, work the fields, fix houses. Teach kids how to ride straight instead of teach them how to hurt. Make them serve the people they wronged." Mace considered the idea. It was radical in its gentleness, punishment without annihilation, responsibility without total erasure. It felt dangerously like rehabilitation disguised as restitution. The Reapers had always been about keeping their own. Perhaps that devotion could be redirected outward. He saw a plan take shape that was not forgiveness as indulgence, but justice as labor, as sweat paid into repair. "That could work," he said slowly. "But there will be men who refuse, men who will choose the old law, silence." He fixed her with a gaze that was equal parts warning and plea. "If they do, they won't be ours anymore." There it was, the line drawn in daylight. Loyalty had to be earned. The club's mythology needed to be pared down, its romanticized violence replaced with a harder, cleaner ethic. Men who covered crimes would be asked to stand down or stand out. Those who had chosen wrong could redeem themselves through rebuilding. It was a kind of mercy Mace could live with because it asked a man to be a better man rather than simply punishing him into absence. Back at the clubhouse, the plan needed backers and executioners. Silas took to it with a grim determination, drafting lists and assigning names. The ledger became a to-do list, statements to be taken, reparations assessed, work crews organized. Some men cheered at the thought of making amends. Others balked at the humiliation. The ones who balked were the real threat. Quietly, Mace prepared for those fractures, planning contingencies that did not trade justice for cruelty. Not everyone was salvageable. A few men, when confronted with the ledger's weight, chose exile over repentance. They left under the hush of night with their damned pride and whatever cash they'd gathered, patches folded like flags of surrender. Some threats were neutralized through banishment rather than blood. It was messy and unsatisfactory, and, in the small calculations of grief, sometimes the only thing they could do without becoming monsters themselves. The angels watched, their colors like a permanent weather front, ready but not overreaching. They had come to keep Rosa's town safe, and they stayed to ensure the Reapers would not retreat into the old, comfortable lies. There were moments of tense collaboration, mutual nods across a fence, shared patrols around the edges of disputed territory. It was, in its own way, an uneasy schooling in new behaviors for old men. Through it all, the real cost was measured in small acts that amounted to change. Men sweeping porches where their brothers had once smashed windows. Bikers delivering sacks of supplies to the families who'd suffered. Members teaching apprentices carpentry and honesty in equal measures. The ledger that once was a weapon became a blueprint. It did not erase grief, it did not restore the dead, but it redirected a culture that had long mistaken dominance for care. Rosa watched the first of the crews with practical eyes. She had wanted safety, she wanted the reparation for her people. She had not expected the burden of watching men rebuild what they had once helped destroy. There was a daily humiliation in seeing the faces of those who'd skirted justice, bending in work and asking forgiveness with calloused hands. But across from the pain was something else, the slow, stubborn reconstruction of trust. And Mace, walking the line between president and something gentler he had not named, felt the edges of his world blur. He had not come to this to be liked.
He had come to keep the club alive and the town intact. What he found, as he stood watching a crew lift lumber into an old worn house, was that protection could look like scaffolding. It could be sweat and apology and the long, attentive work of mending. That realization opened a fissure inside him that felt less like weakness and more like the first true step he had ever taken towards something that might be called redemption. The fractures remained. Men sulked and others left, and old loyalties died hard. But where the ledger had once threatened to tear them apart, it had, paradoxically, given them a task. They could choose to let the wound fester until the whole club collapsed under bitterness, or use the pain to make something steadier. For the first time in a long time, Mace found himself hoping they would not choose the easier, uglier path.
Rose's sequence of small, brave truths had cracked the mythology. Now it was up to all of them to decide whether they'd rebuild a fortress of old lies or a home where people could live without the constant terror of being collateral. That choice would bruise, would cost more nights and more concessions, but it would also, slowly, begin to stitch the fractures together, if the men in the middle had the courage to be less proud than they were afraid. And as the sun dropped low and the day's work wound down, Mace and Rosa stood for a moment watching men carry wood and life into places that had been hollowed by neglect. The ledger lay heavy in their hands still, but they had started to turn its pages into a manual for repair. The fractures were real and terrifying, but for the first time since the tape played, they felt like something that could, with enough stubbornness and sweat, be mended. The first shout came like a bell, sharp, clean, a thing that split air and ordered every head to move. Gunfire answered from the far tree line. 2 shots, then a clatter like a panicked animal. Men dove, tires bit earth. The repair crews froze with lumber mid-lift. Silas barked orders that snapped like cords. Mace didn't think, he moved. Everything narrowed. Boots on gravel, the metallic bite of adrenaline. Rose's hand finding his sleeve with fierce, immediate trust. "Stay low," she hissed. And in the way she said it, there was no distance between protector and protected. The angels flared, a ring of leather and chrome, guns out but controlled, disciplined. Their presence had been a promise. Tonight, it was a hedge against chaos. A figure broke from the trees. Too quick, too practiced. He fired again, aimed at the group near the diner where women and kids had gathered to watch crews rebuild their broken houses. That shot took wood and hope. A child screamed. That scream was a hammer on Mace's heart that made everything else inconsequential. He leapt, shoulder into motion, driving forward with the weight of leadership in each step. Rosa moved with him, her small size a blur of determination. Between them, they became a shield. The shooter hesitated at seeing a president and a woman flanked by angels, then ducked and bolted toward the far road. Silas was already cutting him off. 2 reapers boxed him in, and the man hit the ground hard enough to cough up blood and secrets. He wasn't alone. Another engine idled in the shadow, 2 figures disappearing down a back lane. The ambush was a message. Don't rebuild, the old order whispered. Don't let the ledger change things. Rosa crouched by the child, black hair falling in a curtain. She checked tiny limbs with hands that had been used to patching bikes and patching hearts. The child shook but was breathing. Mace watched the small miracles of her ministrations and felt something brittle inside him shift. He wanted to take the danger onto himself, to stand and say his life covered every risk. But Rosa's eyes met his and held him honest. "Help me," she said, plain and necessary. He did. Together they moved families to a safer space, the angels forming a silent perimeter, like a cliff. Then Mace turned to the captured man. He spat blood and curses, but his eyes named fear more than hatred. "Who sent you?" Mace demanded, voice low and iron.
The man smiled a hole in his face. "You don't need to know," he said. "You need to look under your own beds." That was the grenade thrown by a coward. Mace felt the room tilt, the old paranoia rising like smoke. He could have killed the man for the lie alone. Instead, he felt a new law settle, accountability that avoided vengeance. He forced himself to listen, to extract kernels of truth between blasphemies. The ambushers were local, men who'd chosen exile from the new order and wanted to make sure Reconstruction stopped. They had allies in a fringe, a few reapers who refused to accept the new reckonings. The betrayal cut deeper than any bullet. A name slipped: Ramirez. Mace's chest went cold with a leaden sense of betrayal so personal it felt like homicide. Ramirez had been one of his oldest lieutenants. He had seen him at the table less than a month ago, face set with the hardness of a man who feared loss. Now that fear had metastasized into sabotage. Rosa didn't flinch. She listened, then stood straighter, grief and resolve braided into one blade. "Then we bring him in," she said. "We don't let him kill the future for his pride." Mace looked at her, at the woman who had ridden into his life like thunder and then sewn him back together with something quieter. He felt the old instinct to shield, to take the blow. But the Ledger's labor had taught him another lesson. Leadership meant choosing sacrifice on the scale that saved more than one man. He made his decision as the sun dragged blood across the horizon. "Prepare a takedown," he ordered. "By dawn, we go for Ramirez. No theatrics, no street justice. We bring him to the clubhouse, we hear him, and we let the club decide. Anyone who fires on civilians will not be in our name." Silas's nod was a small thing, but heavy as verdict. The angels moved to seal routes. Rosa slipped her hand into Mace's for a second, an anchor as much as a promise, and he felt a heat there that had nothing to do with adrenaline. He did not let himself imagine steady nights. He let himself imagine doing the right thing, even if it meant breaking the men he'd loved enough to protect. They moved at dawn in a hush. Engines hummed like silently beating hearts. Mace rode with Rosa in the saddle behind him, her arms around his waist, close enough that he could hear the rise and fall of her breath. Beside them, the angels flanked with a discipline that had the look of funeral order. They found Ramirez in a run-down bar, a man holed up with bitterness and a few loyal fools. He went out swinging, pride making him clumsy. He bled more bravely than he had lived. They dragged him back where the club could hold him accountable. The gathering in the clubhouse was raw. Men furious, men relieved, women with hands knotted with grief. Ramirez spat and cursed and claimed betrayal by a culture that had changed under his feet. He deserved punishment, Mace knew. He also deserved the chance to be unmade and remade or to leave. Rosa stood forward when the vote came. Her voice was steady. "No execution," she said. "Let him rebuild what he helped break. Let him learn the cost of his pride. If he refuses, then there's no place for him among us." Murmurs rippled. It was risky, mercy as reform, but it was a gamble that could save the club from becoming the monster it had once been. Mace felt the weight of it, the risk of letting a dangerous man live among them versus the slow work of making amends. He had become a president who wanted to protect not by dominance, but by repair. When Ramirez was led out to work the first dawn crew, shoulders bending under planks of wood, his fury was a live thing. But the sight of him carrying a beam into a house that had once belonged to a widow changed something in more than one spectator. Children watched, women watched. Men who had once shielded him now counted the cost and felt the arithmetic shifting. After the council dissolved and the work resumed, Mace found Rosa by the rear fence where the angels had made camp. She looked at him like someone who had given up being small. He surprised himself by reaching for her hand and pulling her close until she fit against him like a piece of a road that had been missing. He could have told her then that he would keep his oath to the club and to truth, could have promised protection with a ringed vow. Instead, he did what felt most like surrender and most like power. He kissed her, quick, urgent, and full of the messy hope that comes from choosing one person with all the collateral damage that choice might entail.
Rosa kissed him back with a fierceness that left him shaking. When they broke apart, she pressed her forehead to his. "If you fall," she whispered, "make sure we fall towards something worth building." "We will," he said, and he meant it with his bones. Around them men hammered, and children laughed cautiously. The danger had not passed. Betrayals would come, wounds would open. But here, in the grit and the sweat and the unlikely tenderness, Mace and Rosa claimed each other and the harder task they'd chosen: to make protection mean repair. He would give himself to that work, maybe lose pieces of himself in the process. She had already given much. Tonight, his sacrifice would be a different kind, relinquishing the mythology that had kept him safe, and, in its stead, building a life where love and responsibility stood shoulder to shoulder, where the club's power became a scaffold instead of a weapon. They stood together as the sun climbed, two figures in leather and determination. And for the first time in years, Mace felt less like a man defending borders and more like one learning to hold a town and a woman without crushing them. The work slowed into a rhythm that felt like healing. Men hauling lumber, women painting shutters, kids chasing each other under the watch of patched leather and wary smiles. The ledger had turned into a ledger of labor. The club's names were stenciled onto work crews instead of headlines. Ramirez's hands blistered, his curses thinning into concentration. The angels guarded the perimeter with an easy ease now, a presence like weather rather than thunder. Rosa walked through it all with a composed ferocity, accepting thanks with the bluntness of someone who had never wanted praise, only safety. Mace found his mornings no longer measured by patrol routes, but by the slow progress of a roof taking shape over a house that had been hollowed by grief. He'd learned to listen in a different register, to the murmured apologies of men who'd once thought silence enough, to the murmurs of women who had been given room to name their losses. He traded some of his old certainties for something less tidy and more dangerous: accountability that could rebuild as well as punish. It cost him his neat edges. It gave him something unfinished and therefore worth protecting. Rosa surprised him by taking on the work of organizing supplies, teaching a few of the younger reapers how to measure and cut, how to make a straight line when nerves shook. She moved with patience hardened into authority. Men watched her with a new kind of respect, one not born of fear but of competence. When children offered her drawings, she laughed and taped them to the shed, a small gallery of courage. Their thanks were awkward and earnest. It made the town feel less like a wound and more like a place worth standing in. They argued in small mercies and quiet frustrations, about trust and timelines, about which man deserved a second chance and which needed exile. Sometimes they failed. A fight flared at dusk over pay. A drunken man spat at a family, and the old code reared its head like a sneer. But each failure became a lesson carved into policy. No street executions, reparations first, labor before exile. The club learned to be an instrument of repair rather than terror. One evening, after a day of sun and the smell of fresh-cut wood, Mace and Rosa rode out to the town's edge. The road glowed with the soft blue of evening. The rebuilt house stood like a promise. New boards, a bright door, a small swing hung from a beam. Children played in its yard, watched over by men whose faces were still hard but softer around the eyes. Rosa slid off her bike,
and stood with her hand on the swing, looking at the town she had insisted on saving. Mace joined her, shoulder brushing hers. He didn't offer grand speeches. He had learned that words did less than steady work. Instead, he reached for her hand and held it like an agreement. "Not perfect," he said. "No," she replied, voice a quiet laugh, "but better." They watched the sunset fold itself into the horizon, chrome catching the last light. Around them, the club's rumble was no longer a threat, but a backbone. The Angels' colors faded into the evening, not as occupiers, but as allies who had kept a promise. The ledger remained heavy, pages still flipping with consequences, but its weight was shared now. Rosa leaned into Mace, chin on his shoulder, and for once he let himself be held without planning. In the thin, honest light, two people shaped by roads and loss found the simple geometry of togetherness. Not ownership, not dominion, but a hand held steady while work was done. The town's laughter rose like a small, stubborn hymn. Above them, a lone bike passed along the highway, a sound that had once meant everything, and now, slowly, came to mean home.